Good morning and welcome to our second panel. I'm going to ask each of you in turn just to introduce yourselves, if I may. If we could start with Ms Coombs.
My name's Caroline Coombs and I'm co-founder and executive director of Reunite Families UK, and we represent thousands of families who are separated or impacted by the family migration rules.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kate Roberts and I work at an organisation called Flex, or Focus on Labour Exploitation. We're a small UK-based organisation which carries out research and policy work to better understand the factors which create risks of exploitation and how these can be prevented and addressed.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Thomas, Senior Fellow at the Social Market Foundation think tank with a focus on migration.
Well, you're all very welcome. I think you were all in the room as well for the first session, so you heard the contributions that were made. I wondered if I could just ask each of you in turn to reflect on the 5-point plan that was announced last December and the particular issues from your organisation's perspective that you are most concerned about. And I'd also be interested to know about whether you have engaged in any way with the Home Office in the proposals that were put forward. So, I don't know, Kate Roberts, would you like to start?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think my sort of overarching reflection on the 5-point plan is that obviously it didn't have an aim to specific. Well, the exploitation was mentioned, but the plan didn't aim to prevent or address exploitation. It primarily was looking at net migration figures. So, certainly we were surprised by several elements of it. It came in the context of a lot of concern around social care workers being exploited, but the main changes, as has already been discussed by the other panel, was preventing social care workers from bringing dependents and the CQC registration requirements. So, we know that the main ways to address exploitation are to make sure that all workers have options to report exploitation without fear that things will ultimately work out worse for them. And as we've seen with a lot, and was mentioned again by the previous panel, with a lot of reporting on the social care worker visa, is that when workers are scammed, so they're brought on the promise of work. They've left their jobs, their community to come here, and then the work doesn't exist, or they're paid very, very, very badly and exploited. The impact of that is their employer's license. The employer loses their license, and then the worker has 60 days to find new work. But in the interim, they're facing destitution. And mounting debt. And then we also hear alarming stories of, as workers get near the deadline, of finding a new sponsor, people attempting to scam them again, saying I can sponsor your visa again, but there'll be a high fee. So what we would have liked to have seen is a focus on proactive labour market enforcement and a safety net for some of those, for workers who are exploited. So they know that if they speak to the authorities, the outcome is more likely to end up in redress for them and improvement in their situation, support to find decent work, rather than their immigration status being at risk.
And have you been able to feed in your concerns about exploitation in the labour market to the Home Office? Are you engaged in any dialogue with them?
It's been challenging to engage with the Home Office. The Home Office's Vulnerability Advisory Group was reconfigured some years ago, and we have been requesting to have discussions which particularly focus on risks of exploitation in the immigration systems of it, but that's not been forthcoming, no.
Okay, so you've not met with officials or ministers? That's not been available to you?
No.
No, okay. Okay, Mr Thomas, anything you'd like to say about the 5-point plan?
Yes, I mean, obviously, unlike the other two members on this panel, I do have a broader remit, and there's been a lot of discussion already on it today. I would say that overall, obviously, it's quite a scattergun approach, but its common denominator is clearly focused on reducing numbers, while having the least impact maybe on the positive contributions of certain parts of immigration to the UK. And I think one of the reasons that dependents have been focused on is that they're obviously a lever that can be moved very quickly. They can be directly controlled and stopped, but also, as the MAC pointed out yesterday, I think in their report on students, dependents are not really tracked by the Home Office or indeed anybody else in terms of their contribution. So we don't know what they do. So in terms of arguments about is stopping dependence of care workers or stopping dependence of students, we're focused on the impact on the students and the care workers, but what are those dependents? What have they been doing? We don't really know. So obviously, it's sort of easier to cut back on those. I could say quite a lot about social care and students and exploitation, and I'm sure we'll get on to some of that. But I just thought I would focus on the kind of private sector changes, because until the last 2 minutes of the first panel, I think there was a feeling that the private sector changes are quite small for two reasons. One is obviously a lot of jobs are not in that sector, and there's special dispensations for health and care, education, and also that some of the impact, or quite a lot of the impact, should have been made already. And of course, businesses lost their access to freedom of movement. So haven't they changed already? What's the problem here? We can get into a bit more detail, perhaps why some have changed not very much so far, and why some have already changed a lot. But I do think the changes are big changes. They are kind of fourfold. I mean, they're all linked together. There's the salary threshold change. There's the occupation-specific threshold change from 25 to 50%. That's quite a big deal. There was the debate at the end of the last panel about the SOL and the new immigration salary list, but whatever way you look at it, that has hugely reduced over the recent period, and the end of the going rate threshold discount for being on that list. They are all pretty big changes taken together, and indeed the MAC pointed that out. If you read right to the end of their immigration salary list report, they said, gosh, we actually recommended you to do away with the going rate discount. Thanks for doing that now, but we didn't realise you were going to do it at the same time you made these other changes. So I think to a point that Molly Morris made at the end of the last panel, and indeed this is part of the student debate as well, where the MAC are sort of saying, gosh, we thought we were going to have to look at the graduate visa route, but we didn't know we were going to make this dependent restriction at the same time. Is when you look at things, altogether, you might then need to revisit some of the changes. And the MAC have said, well, you might want to think about this again now that you have made all these other changes. So business are now going to have to adapt to this, and business generally adapts where it gets a very clear long-term steer. So I think one of the things to look at, certainly in the private sector space, is what is going to happen after the next election. Whoever wins the next election, are the rules going to stay broadly the same? In which case, I think business will know that it is then moved to a brand new world that it needs to adapt to.
That's very helpful. And I think, are you able to say whether the business organisations, do they have access to the Home Office? And are they consulted? And are they engaged in being able to influence policy?
Yes, I mean, I think of all the six panellists this morning, I'm probably the last person to ask about access to the Home Office. In fact, one of the gratifying things of coming to a hearing like this is that I hear that it's not just me who isn't able
take
to.
It personally.
So I'm not taking it personally. I think one of the issues that business have is, for understandable reasons, and when I mention private sector and business, there's always this huge caveat that covers lots of different types of sectors, but also businesses within sectors. That tends to be quite disparate in how it feeds into policy, or it feeds in at such a high level like the CBI, that it's quite hard for them to represent different views. And some of these impacts of the migration system are very, can be quite specific. They can be quite inadvertent, and you need to feed in. So I think everybody, has that issue, and business more so, I think, because of things that have happened with, freedom of movement, post-Brexit immigration system, and now this. Of course they try and influence, but business is always, private sector is always seeing, the world change, life change, and is maybe more in, not that we don't want the best rule set, but more in that we do need to adapt to what the rule set is. And the final point I would make, by the way, they do adapt to what the rule set is, not what politicians say it should be. So the fact that we had a lot of tough rhetoric about immigration, but an unbelievably liberal freedom of movement system, we had a lot of tough rhetoric about immigration and then a pretty liberal post-Brexit immigration system. That's one of the reasons they didn't make many changes, right? I know we're talking about exploitation and people who don't abide by the rules, but most business world does abide by the rules, and they look at what the rules are, not at what somebody says they would like them to be.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Coombs, would you like to comment on your particular concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak to the family migration, but we were deeply concerned and quite frankly very shocked by the sudden increase to the threshold. It's fair to say that there hadn't been an increase since 2012. However, we represent a lot of families, and women in particular, who simply can't even meet the 18,600 threshold because they're looking after children as well as trying to sponsor their partner, and also younger couples or older couples. So we have an awful lot of people who were suddenly thrown into chaos. There was no impact assessment, there was no consultation. It was pegged to a skilled worker route that we were just we just didn't know where that came from, and in a space that has become so toxic in this country, and we deal with an area of migration that few people, most of the public, don't actually know is an issue. When I speak of this, about my own personal experience, because I'm lived experience, they simply say, "What? But you're married, you have a child together, how can you not be able to be in this country?" And the fact is, most people don't realise it's a qualified right, which is absolutely outrageous. As a British citizen, I should be able to be here in this country with my non-British partner and our child without concern, but that is absolutely not the case.
Are you able to say briefly what happened to you then? What was your personal experience? Do you feel comfortable to say that, or?
Yes, I mean, I think my situation was very different. I met my husband in Ecuador when I was living over there. We got married, and I thought, I need to get back to England before then I became pregnant, and I thought I need to get back to England before I can no longer carry a camera, because at the time I was working in television. And so I came back, and when I had the baby in Britain. I fell into very serious depression and had exceedingly dark thoughts. And then there was an earthquake in Ecuador where we were living, which is very serious. My husband was over here at the time, able to be here with me for the birth. And we sought legal advice, and not great legal advice, to be fair. And we were refused. And we then went on to do an appeal, which took a year, basically wiped out the first year of my family life. And even to this day, I find it quite difficult to talk about, because we were put on an exceptional circumstances route. The appeal, in 20 minutes, they overturned it and said, "This is ridiculous. You're a family. You should be able to be here."
You now offer support to individuals who are in similar circumstances and need
because
help.
Of that.
Yeah.
And I was one of the lucky ones.
Yeah.
So many families, most of our families are separated for months, if not years. And we've got so many families. I have my own mental health issues because of that. But we've got families who are separated. And I can't even tell you how desperate it is every single day to have to hear the stories that we hear. The depression, the anxiety, the children is the worst. Like having to listen to how children are being utterly devastated.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It's very helpful to hear what was an awful experience, to help put this into context when you're dealing with families, husbands and wives and children. It's very upsetting to hear what happened to you and so many other people.
And as I say, I was one of the lucky ones, and it's so upsetting when you hear people talking about how they just simply want to be here. We have the narrative of dependence, the narrative of burdened taxpayer, and we repeatedly, against a brick wall, we hit our head saying there is no recourse to public funds. My husband has on his, we're still on a route, by the way, and we spent, I don't know, £12,000 so far, living in, a cost of living crisis. We haven't been able to even go back to Ecuador for my son, who's now 8, to meet his family over there. My stepdaughters have to get visit visas to come here, which is expensive. So for our family to be complete, we still have to go through that hurdle as well. But it's incredible, the absolute complex, expensive, ridiculous, unnecessary pathways that you have to go through as a British citizen and settled citizens as well to be here. We've got families who are exiled. They can't even come back. Post-Brexit, and a lot aren't even realising this applies to them. It's only when they turn around and think, or they have a situation where perhaps mum or dad is older, they're needing care, and when they suddenly look into it, I mean, I certainly didn't go and look at is there an issue for me and my husband to be here? There just wasn't even that thought process. It was only when we came up against it, we thought, what? This is crazy.
I think we're going to have some more questions on that directly. Tim Lawton, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Could I come on to the issue of non-UK nationals coming to work in the UK on a temporary basis, and the impact then that the changes to carer, people working in the care sector, their dependents has had. Ms. Roberts, what impact have you seen so far? We've heard about potential impact ahead of the actual changes coming in. Are you seeing evidence of that?
Well, I mean, I think the issue is that we're still in a situation where we're seeing the effects of workers being invited here to work and taking up a job in good faith, and there being very little labour market enforcement or protection of their conditions when they're here. So there's still the situation where workers, once they get here and things are not what they have promised, it's very hard for them to know how they can access redress in any way. There's the system, the sector just remains massively under-resourced and under-regulated in terms of labour market enforcement. So there's been the change of the CQC, but the CQC don't. They look at quality of care. They don't look at working conditions and pay. They're not a labour market regulator.
What I'm trying to get at, and there was certainly some stories about people coming here to work in care homes that didn't exist. Now, was that scams by people traffickers, and those people being recruited were being duped effectively? There seemed to be quite a big increase in those cases of those. So where enforcement clearly was not all that it needed to be. Where is the real abuse coming from? People are being falsely trafficked here for non-existent jobs, or they're being trafficked here for jobs which don't come up to the quality that one would expect if they're being employed UK nationals. Where is the real abuse going on?
I think it's a number of different things. There's not one factor that's caused this crisis, because what you've done, you've got a very the adult care sector is massively unregulated. I think this is a core part of this problem. It's been underfunded for a very long time, and then on top of it, there was a lack of due diligence in the issuing of the visas, which has resulted in, as you say, people in very large numbers applying for jobs which didn't exist and being issued visas to come to the UK, and either the jobs didn't exist or the work was really not what they were promised. So the workers have been left in a situation where they may have incurred really significant amounts of debt, have no recourse to public funds, and literally be looking at destitution. Now, there's not one silver bullet to solve that problem, but ultimately, the situation is really compounded by the fact that once workers arrive here and they face that situation, it's not. In this sector where there's a real lack of proactive labour market enforcement, it's very hard for workers to know where they can turn to for help, because it's not they will be threatened or be told that the effect of speaking out will mean the sponsor gets their licence revoked.
Yep.
Yeah, they're looking at removal.
Has that improved? Because certainly I'm hearing a lot in my constituency of complaints from legitimate care homes who are having to wait ages for those for the licences to be granted, such that they can't then fill the spaces that they've got. So the job offer lapses, which suggests there's now better enforcement, although still the Home Office being very inefficient in its processes. Do you think things have changed?
They may have done. There have been, as the previous panel spoke about, that there have been. There have been changes. There should be more checks done prior to visas being issued. There are still people who are coming here and still being exploited and still left in a situation of extreme vulnerability. That is still happening now, and it's very it is particularly frustrating, as you say, at a time where there's workers here who are left without work, and there's care home providers who desperately need workers, and it seems complete, to make no sense at all.
Disconnect. Ms. Coombs, can I ask you, in terms of specifically the impact of the clampdown on now dependents coming with workers in the care home sector, are you seeing that's deterring people, or people are still coming but without the dependents that they might have been able to bring before? Are we seeing the impacts of that yet?
It's not care workers, and in that space, it's not an area that we deal with. So that's not an answer. That's not something that I can answer. We specifically deal with British and settled citizens who are here and whose partners are not from here and are coming into this country. They may be care workers, but no, that's not something I can answer, I'm afraid.
Mr. Thomas, have you any comments on that situation?
Yes, I would just say, but you've I think hit a very important nail on the head, which is one of the explanations for the Home Office in how this arose. Partly was that they were very cognizant of the shortages in the sector and the need to get these applications to go through quickly. So clearly there is a balancing act, but as has been said, it's a very unregulated sector. So, and because of the other things that have happened in the immigration system, you've got this strange dichotomy that it is a very unattractive job, but a very attractive immigration route, because most of those other low-paid, low-skilled routes have now gone. So there are low barriers to entry, and most of the other things that had low barriers to entry are not so available anymore. It's a very disparate, lightly regulated sector, lots of demand which supports working by people who are here lawfully and people who are here unlawfully. So in one sense it's a terrible job, but in another sense it's what I would call the golden rung on the bottom of the ladder, into the UK. And for instance, there's a lot of discussion in the Max report yesterday about how many international students are then going into social care. And just to a point that was made by Brian Bell, where he said, look, there hasn't been a bespoke care route before. This is quite a new thing. I think the thing to remember about the old system was that, as he said, people who worked here or who should have been working here in social care from outside the EU had come through other routes and therefore had a lot more flexibility and power in what they could do. But also under freedom of movement, there weren't huge amounts of people actually from the EU. Brexit wasn't a total disaster for the social care system. The social care system was not totally peopled with people from the EU, but there were people who would come from the EU. They would work in hospitality, they would do a social care job, they would go back and forth and move around. It brought a lot of flexibility to the edges of the system. But again, if those people didn't really like it, they could go and work in a pub, or they would just go back home and then decide what they were going to do. So that landscape has changed, quite dramatically in that sense.
Thank you.
But if I could just add, it is really, we were in the context of the deep concern about the wide-scale exploitation in the adult care sector, to then see the GLAA's budget, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority's budget, cut for 24-25. If we're going to be inviting people here on restrictive visas, we really need to be proactively having a labour market enforcement approach for the conditions of work.
Thank you.
Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. Kate, I just wanted to pick up on that point that you've just raised about exploitation, because we discussed that in the first panel, and you talked about labour enforcement, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about who you think should be doing that and how it should be happening.
So, I was mentioned briefly in the earlier panel, a mention of a single enforcement body for labour market enforcement, which, has been long, it's been a long promised body. We think we strongly support the idea of an effective single enforcement body. There's certain elements that would need to be included to make this effective, and unfortunately one of them is resourcing. We need to properly enforce our labour market enforcement in the UK, because at the moment not only is the labour inspector landscape just highly fragmented, so there's lots of scope for just sectors to fall between gaps. Whose responsibility is it to enforce? But while there's no enforcing, I'm afraid to say, unscrupulous employers just they can make the assessment that it's more profitable for them to exploit their workers, because the workers, particularly if they're on sponsor-specific visas, won't speak out because of the consequences we've already covered. And what's going to happen to them if there's only an immigration enforcement response in terms of compliance? The worst thing that happens to them is they'll lose their sponsor license. So we do need a situation where employers know that they will be inspected by labour market enforcement and they will be held to account. Another element, as well as enough resourcing for proactive labour market enforcement inspections, would be that we'd like to see secure reporting embedded into this, so that labour market enforcement is dealt with separately from immigration enforcement, so workers know that if they're speaking about workplace exploitation and abuse, is going to be dealt with completely separately from their immigration status.
I mean, you mentioned that the health and social care sector is very fragmented. And I mentioned earlier about Unison and some of Unison's recommendations in terms of the work that they do within that field. And they've talked about increased roles for local authorities. And I just wondered if you had any thought about an increased role for local authorities looking at unscrupulous care sector providers.
I think there's potentially a role for local authorities, but I mean, I do think ultimately that should be in addition to having an effective single enforcement body for labour market enforcement. So we're creating, so we move away from having these high-risk sectors where there's a real downward pressure on pay and conditions. So that, yeah, local authorities could have a role in that, but ultimately, they would make up part of what would be a single enforcement body. So workers we'd like to see a situation where workers wouldn't really need to work out, do I have to go to the local authority about this? Do I have to go to HMRC? They would go to the single enforcement body, and then the specialist enforcement agency would then deal with the issue.
The CQC has a much more expanded role now in terms of looking at sponsorship issues. And I just wanted to know from your point of view whether they have been adequately resourced and have the capacity to undertake this enhanced role.
I don't believe they've been adequately resourced. I would also, with all respect to the CQC, question if they're not a labour market enforcement body. Is this their expertise? They're a care quality commission. So I would have questions about resourcing. I've not heard of any substantive increase in their resourcing, but also why they would be placed in charge of labour market enforcement.
James Daly.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I ask Mr Thomas this question first? The information I have in front of me here is that Home Office granted 350,000 health and care visas in 2023 in total, including dependents, compared to 118,000 skilled visas in other sectors. So clearly we have a very top-heavy use of granting social care visas in terms of that route into this country. Can I ask, if I was applying to come into this country and I said that I was a social care worker, what qualification would I need to prove that I am a social care worker and can work and carry out the duties in a social care home, facility, whatever it may be?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing to say is that there has been an explosion in the numbers of visas, and this is because it is a new route which started from February 2022 in a sector that is in a particular situation. And you're right, but that there isn't a formal qualification. There's arguments and debates within the sector of how to professionalise it more, but also how to certify that professionalisation. And they are not in place at the moment. But one other thing I would say is that there is some difference in the care sector between different types of care providers. There are huge numbers of small providers in this sector, but we shouldn't forget that there are also some very big providers in this sector, and there are very big providers who span care and health. And they tend to be much more focused on the types of people they can get in, whether a lot of the people coming in might have a background where they can work in health as well.
Mr Thomas, you answered the question, and thank you for that, in terms of you need no qualification whatsoever to come in. So in terms of the health and care visa, it is uniquely susceptible at both ends of the spectrum to fraud. We just heard Kate describe in terms of bogus employers, sponsoring people coming into the country on bogus jobs, which I can only accept at face value. But what it basically allows is people who have never worked at social care in their lives, who want to come into this country, claim they are a social care worker, and then disappear within 5 minutes of coming into this country. An extremely easy route to migration status, doesn't it?
Well, I think I'd push back on the use of the word fraud. There are a number of entry-level jobs in this country, and always have been, whether that's social care or hospitality, where people can work in those jobs with either minimal or no qualifications. That is not fraudulent. That's just part of the way that industry and that sector works.
If you claim that you want to come work in the social care sector, there is no qualification required whatsoever, and you have the intent that I'm not coming over to work in the social care sector, I'm coming over to take advantage of whatever that person sees as the benefits of living in this country, we are seeing the wide-scale exploitation of this route and means of emigration into the country, aren't we, through this social
I think that would only become clearer where you know what the progression of the people in social care is, because they obviously have the social care visa. They have other ways into the social care visa through different routes, but I think at the moment it's not clear. A lot of people are going to work in social care. A lot of those people might not have worked in social care before. It's absolutely true that a lot of people working in social care in this country, it's not their ideal job. And I don't think that means they're fraudulent people. They're a lot of migrants will take a job to get their feet on the ground to...
Whole opinion, Mr. Thomas, isn't it?
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just say that the final question to you, Mr. Thomas, is that when you were talking about employers in the private sector, what you were basically meaning was that it suits private sector employers to have cheap labour because it gives them better profits. The more cheap labour this private sector can import into this country, the better they are, and that's what we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years that's motivated the reasons why care homes and others will take advantage of this.
Yes, I don't think I did say that, but I don't think I would necessarily disagree that business are obviously focused with the costs of the people they're employing and would like to employ, a most effective cost employee.
Kate, can I just ask, in terms of just following on, I think you used the phrase, forgive me if I got this wrong, a lack of due diligence in the Home Office in terms of processing social care visa applications. So not only do we have the situation that I've described to Mr. Thomas, we also have a Home Office who are not carrying out the most basic tasks to ensure that these jobs exist or that these people are serious about working in the social care sector. Is that correct?
That has, there have been examples, including in the, I'm sure you're familiar with the ICIBI's inspection report into the social care sector, of licenses being offered when it's really questionable as to whether there was work. And certainly the experience of workers is that they have arrived having migrated in good faith, believing they were coming to work, and the work which was promised has not been available. As has already been referenced in the earlier panel, there, as I understand it, have been changes, some changes in the way that visas are checked, to try and address this. So I would hope things are going to improve.
Kate, you can understand, can't you, certainly I'll say from my individual, but probably from a committee perspective, that we have a system where 350,000 visas have been granted, where it seems to me that there is no due diligence at all being carried out by the Home Office in respect to that. You simply put on a piece of paper, I want to come and work at this care home in this part of the country, and you're in. That's it.
I mean, I'm not privy to the inside Home Office processes, but it's certainly of great concern that there are workers who, as I've said, have come to this country in good faith and are left in a situation where they are facing destitution and can't support themselves.
I mean, clearly that's a very unfortunate situation, but I take it would be your view that if you're saying that destitution, we should be looking at a scheme, a process whereby the British government, if they require funds, can help them go back to their country of origin if there is no job here for them, because clearly the whole point of being here has gone, and therefore it would seem to me a good idea to help and assist them to do that, wouldn't it?
My view would be that if workers have come here in good faith to work in a sector where we have a clear need for workers, we have systems and processes in place to secure fairness and redress for those workers. Yeah. So, we certainly don't want a two-tier workforce where there's one group of workers who the employer, because they have the power of being their visa sponsor, can say anything to them to threaten them not to speak up. What we need is for those workers to be able to be supported to find decent employment.
If I was a criminal listening to this evidence, I would think, fantastic. What we need to do is bring somebody into the country, bring their dependents in on a completely false prospectus, and then they can disappear when they're in this country because there's no job, and we can bring them within the black economy. And essentially what that allows is a criminal free-for-all for people to do whatever they want. And I think it's incredibly dangerous for us to go down that route. We cannot have a situation where, because of fraud, because of overt fraud, we are therefore allowing people to stay in this country. It seems utterly bizarre to...
So what appears very clear to me is we need a system whereby workers who are in this country are supported to remain legal, remain visible, remain incentivised to go to the authorities for assistance because they know it will work out well for them.
And you and I both know that's never going to happen in a million years, is it?
I know that where workers want to remain, workers do not want to be driven into exploitation and underground. So what we need is a system where workers feel confident that if they go to the authorities for assistance, it will work out well for them.
Thank you very much.
Listen to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to say, first of all, I have a constituent who's ended up in this situation where he's come over here to work and the job has not been there for him, and then has been plunged into this uncertainty of trying to find something else. So I understand some of the issues that you're talking about. Can I ask what the situation would be for Scotland? Because obviously the CQC doesn't have any remit in Scotland, and the care sector in Scotland is regulated under the Care Inspectorate and the Scottish Social Services Council.
So apologies, I don't actually know the answer to that. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm just kind of curious as to whether there had been any discussions on that as well. Because I note that the MAC report on care services reflected that Scotland has a lower take-up rate for care worker visas because the sector has higher remuneration and a professionalisation as well under the worst work strategy that we had. Would that be a better model to implement for the rest of the UK?
I mean, as I say, I'm not familiar with the system, but certainly what we would want to see a driving up of standards, paying conditions and qualifications in the sector, yes.
Nathan, you were nodding.
Yeah, I mean, all to say is that from what the MAC have written, it's very clear that, yes, they think that would be the Scottish approach is a better approach, but that's reading their one line and around their one line.
Thank you. Moving to the issue around family visas, which I wanted to ask about in a bit more detail. You'd said that the policy coming in had obviously been quite a shock, it had been quite sudden. There was a particularly difficult period for my constituents, certainly between the announcement being made and then the slight changes and nuances on the policy over Christmas. Can you tell us a wee bit more about what you were dealing with the folk that you deal with in your organisation over that period?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we had. There was no consultation. It came just before Christmas, which was a very lovely Christmas present for our families, which is already a difficult time for those who are separated. And obviously, first of all, it was announced, and there wasn't. We didn't know whether it affected people who were already here, like myself included, and then obviously. There was a turnaround, and it was going to be for people who were coming into the country, as if that was okay. You know, we've still got lots and lots of families who simply just want to be a family and cannot be a family, and it was horrendous. Christmas was literally blighted once again. The Boxing Day of the previous Christmas, there had been an article in the Times alluding to the fact that there may be changes to the family migration threshold, and then nothing said since. And we do have engagement with the Home Office, and so we were quite very surprised that there was no forewarning, there was no consultation. We are known for what we do because we specifically deal with this area. As an organisation, we've got, 4th of December, we had steady 2,500 members. Between then and now, we've got over 4,600 members. It went up massively, and every single day we have new members coming. And there are so many people who don't even know that we exist. And when they come to us, they're like, how did we not know you exist? We are so grateful and thankful that you are here, because they are lost, they are scared, they are vulnerable, and they cannot understand why they're being targeted this way.
I had much the same experience in terms of the emails that I've received from people as well. It's been quite difficult for lots of folk and hearing those stories. How do you regard the move from the 18,000 to the 29,000 and then this potential further threshold to 38,000?
As I mentioned earlier, we have members, especially women, who are trying to juggle childcare, trying to juggle a job, whilst also trying to raise money for the extortionate fees, and who are they weren't even meeting the 18,600. So to suddenly raise it to 29,000, which half the population wouldn't earn, was crazy. When it first came out at 38,700, we just didn't know what to think about that, because such a vast amount of the population don't earn that money. And what it's basically saying is you and your family are not welcome here because you don't earn enough, you're not good enough, you're not worthy, so toddle off, go back to your partner's country or stay in your partner's country. And what an awful message, and equally the impacts of that on the children is absolutely unacceptable and simply outrageous. You know, children that are being devastated. And also what we're saying to the next generation, that go off, go work abroad, go travel abroad, but don't you dare fall in love with somebody because you won't be allowed back here. And, you know, and I think most people should be very worried about that their children will be blocked out of family life here, and they may suddenly find themselves unable to see their grandkids and their children.
Do you think it's, how do you feel about the notion that it only really affects the income of one person? It doesn't take account of the whole family potential income from the partner's earnings?
Yeah, I mean, the first application, it absolutely falls on the British or the settled citizens' shoulders, and that's a massive, massive pressure. We've got partners who are IT engineers, software engineers, teachers, chefs, tradespeople, and regardless of what they actually do for a living, they work and they want to contribute. And when they come here, they are not dependents, and quite frankly, it's massively insulting to be regarded as a dependent. My husband was like, you know, he was a businessman who, when he got here and was able to work, he went to factories. He didn't care what he did. All he wanted to do was provide for us. And, you know, that gets completely overlooked. And let's just wheel out the narrative of being a burden to the taxpayer when, again, I repeat, no recourse to public funds. And even if there is the very small chance that gets lifted, I mean, there's about 2.5 million of people who have no recourse to public funds. There's 2,500 of those actually were successful. And the exceptional circumstances route, it's so exceptional, nobody knows actually what is exceptional, and there are children who are being devastated, and that is not classed as exceptional. We don't know how many people, you know, freedom of information request was done, which we heard about earlier. There are no stats on that. Well, if it's a provision, why do we not have figures on how many are applied for? What we do know is that there's going to be a lot more demand on that, which means there's going to be a demand on the Home Office. There's going to be fee waivers, which we know there's already a backlog because people can't afford the fees. They're extortionate. The administration costs versus what we pay and we don't get back when we're refused is outrageous. Given we are struggling with putting food on our tables, people not being able to pay bills, you've got, you know, mums pushing themselves crazy because they're trying to sponsor their partner, and it's deciding. I've had some people say, I'm struggling to eat because I'm making sure my kids eat.
I've had constituents putting these things on credit cards as well and being massively in
I went
debt.
into massive debt, credit card debt, just to be able to keep us afloat. At one point, you know, I regarded myself as quite a successful, you know, in my career. At one point, we were in a caravan in my friend's garden with a 6-month-old baby because of this. And I was like, how did it come to this? Outrageous.
Yeah, absolutely. Share your concerns about this, it's awful. Can you tell me what extent will this increase have on the number of families that are opting for the 10-year route now?
Well, I mean, people aren't going to be able to meet the 29,000. It's as simple as that. And we don't even know how many people are affected, because there are so many people who couldn't even meet the 18,600. So, how much that's going to push up those that are affected, and then seeking exceptional, which is expensive. It's an onerous application process, and we don't even know what constitutes, as I mentioned, what exceptional actually is. The bar seems so very high, and it's a 10-year route, as I say, so that's thousands of pounds, and it's making people vulnerable. And we don't know, we've seen how quickly the goalposts can be shifted, and how that can devastate families. So, it's the number of exceptional circumstances will no doubt go up. And in fact, I was on a call with lawyers who were specifically going through exceptional circumstances as an application process, because they recognised just how much need there's going to be. And they were specifically saying, you need to get your head around this route, because there's going to be a lot. And that is just going to have a massive impact on the resources from the Home Office, who are already struggling.
And on top of the visa fees itself, you have the immigration health surcharge as well.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular views on that and the impact it has?
Yeah, so I mean, we paid on application the surcharge, and then when my husband was able to work, he pays national insurance and he pays his income taxes, and so we're effectively double taxed. And when we get to the end of our route, which is actually a 7.5-year route, because what they also do is they have a stop the clock mechanism. So when you do meet the minimum income requirement, which we did, and we had no idea that this was the case, so we just went along with our 2.5-year route, went to say, right, we meet it, even though we'd met it before, and they said, we're just going to now put you on the 5-year route, but that means we're going to put you back to zero. So the 2.5 years we'd done no longer mattered. And so we were on a 7.5-year route, randomly. And there's been an acknowledgement in the Home Office that that is not a fair element of the policy.
Thank you. Just wanted to know if Kate and Jonathan had anything to add on these issues.
Not from me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark Olongi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm slightly loath to sort of come to you here. Mrs. Coombs, I'm sorry, because you've spoken a lot about your personal experience, which I find eminently relatable, but I also acknowledge through my own personal experiences that we live in a rules-based society, and whilst I think it's important as policymakers, for us to hear where perhaps those rules might not be right, need changing, I'm not actually hearing suggestions coming from the panel that would actually do that, because the inference of everything I think you've said is that what we have at the moment just simply doesn't work, and you prefer it to be very different, but you don't say what, because something has to be there, because otherwise, what we're talking about is a complete free-for-all. Now, I know that a lot of the countries that people come from have rules themselves. So, if you wanted to go and live and work or become a citizen of that country, try Australia. It's tough. And there are reciprocal arrangements. I mean, I am married to a Brazilian, South American as you are. I have extended family. My father's Italian, and a lot of my extended family is from all over the place. So I could actually sit there as a witness just as much as you, Mrs. Coombs. So whilst I really don't want to comment on your specific case, you have used your specific case to say just how awful the system is, but you haven't really come forward with a suggestion as to what might be productive and what might be an alternative to the to the system that you have faced.
I mean, I haven't been able to get to that point yet. But we, as an organisation, we've certainly been having discussions about what it could look like, and I mean, ultimately, our families and we agree that as British and settled citizens, there ought to be a right to be here as a family in the UK. there wasn't a minimum income threshold prior to 2012, and it seemed to be working just fine in terms of numbers. But if there had to be one, at least peg it to something like the minimum wage, where it would make it fair and it would make it accessible, and also a bit easier for the Home Office to administer as well, because it would be pegged to a minimum wage. We would like, the route to settlement is long. 5 years, it's a lot of paperwork involved as well, a lot of onerous paperwork, a lot of repetitive paperwork. So we'd like to see a shorter route to settlement for meeting the MIR, a 2-year route, for not meeting, so an exceptional route should be capped at 5 years, and simplifying the process. There needs to be, when every time, and when it gets to our sort of renewal, the heart rate goes up, and so here we go again, and the questions can be quite, we get a lot of people extremely worried about answering incorrectly because the consequences are so vast.
Would you accept that some of the systems are in place actually to test the strength of the relationship in the marriage, and whether actually something is genuine or not? I mean, we've all heard about scam marriages, we've all heard about how people offer their services in order to get a piece of paper that then says, oh yes, you're free to stay in the country now forever, and really there wasn't a real marriage or a real relationship there at all. So I'm not envious of the people who have to come to these judgments and set up a rules-based system that explores effectively and fairly how that works. So yes, it'd be nice not to have these rules at all, wouldn't it? And I think, and it would be nice to have everything a lot easier and a lot shorter, but I don't think I've really heard from, not just from yourself, but from the rest of the panel, what that might look like.
I mean, when we start talking about sham marriages, it's conflating it a bit, and I think we as an organisation support and work with genuine couples and families who simply want to be here, and that is who they are. And we have to, the application process is so incredibly intrusive, and there are simpler ways in which you can prove your relationship, but the amount of evidence that you have to give, the photos, the going into your WhatsApp, everything, it's incredibly intrusive, and that shouldn't need to be the case.
I'm very conscious that we are running out of time, so I just want to check, is there anything else you want to ask?
Can I just say one thing on that last question, which is because I suppose having a broader remit, I'm a bit more in it. I'm trying to work out how the system works between people and systems, and there needs to be a balance. But I would say I'm in Madeline Sumption's camp, but when you look at the changes in the 5-point plan, this was a huge outlier, and the rationale did not appear to make sense in the same way that it did for the other changes. Whether you agreed with those changes or not, there seemed to be, coherence there. And I think one of the things that comes out to me a lot from trying to intermediate between the Home Office and people like who are on this panel is this side of the debate gets to put their evidence to the Home Office, but rarely do you see what evidence the Home Office are looking at. Everybody assumes that the Home Office are making terrible, unevidence-based decisions, but they are seeing some of the things that you were talking about. The problem is we never see what they're seeing. They never reveal, their evidence. And I think talking across the system as a whole, it would be a real eye-opener for people working in policy and for some NGOs if the Home Office said, yeah, I hear you, but here is all the abuse or all the exploitation or all the things going wrong that we see. We don't see what they see, so it's hard to have a rational debate.
That's a very interesting point, actually, because we've certainly asked the Home Office for evidence on a number of occasions, and it's not been forthcoming to the committee. So transparency would be very helpful. Brendan, is there anything you'd like to ask?
Thank you. Yeah, just very, very quickly on that. Obviously, there's the sort of more clear-cut spousal issues and getting visas for that, and what we've done with the amount you have to earn. One of the criticisms in the past, whether it's been social care visas or whatever, is when people have brought relatives over, whether they've been sometimes elderly or have had significant health problems. In experience, have you seen there's a disproportionate of that has gone on? Have you noticed that, obviously we've put things like the surcharge in for the NHS and so on. Is there has there been almost a problem or a bit of a pushback with that there are some people who have maybe tried to use the system for that, or there's a disproportionately high amount of that coming from certain areas? Jonathan, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak
that.
to the evidence, but I would see that in exactly the same camp. But there are obviously good reasons for letting some of those people enter the country and reunite with their families. There are clearly also incentives for people to use that to access certain services here, and there is evidence that has, and stories that has happened, and therefore the whole point of the system is to balance, try and get a balance between being fair to people who want to come, but being fair to people who are relying on the system to have a fair rules-based approach.
But if I could just add to that, I think we need to be very careful that we don't, we're not just in effect having a two-tier system where some workers have rights and because they're not on a restrictive visa, and other workers who we have, I reiterate, invited here because our sectors need them, they're treated as commodities. They don't have family rights or in effect the right to get ill, because if they get ill they might be also sacked and lose their visa. So I just think we just need to be very careful that we're not creating a two-tier workforce here.
So we are coming to the end of this session. If there is anything else that you feel we haven't asked you about that you wanted to tell us, would you please write to us with anything extra, and we will certainly consider that. Can I thank all three of you for your contributions this morning? It's been very helpful, really interesting, and thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. We appreciated hearing that, so thank you. Thank you very much, and order, that's the end of the session.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.